Hello again, everybody. Welcome back. We're continuing on again today with our series on king and pawn endings. In our previous videos, we've looked over opposition. We looked at what happens when the pawn gets to the 6th rank and we're trying to promote it. But now we're going to look at what if that pawn has not advanced as far? What technique should we use in order to drive our pawn home to victory? So in this study today, we're going to look at if we have the white pieces. Now we've got our kings on the starting squares and a pawn here on e2. And how do we know what we should do in order to promote this pawn? We want to get it all the way to the other side, of course. What technique should we use? How are we going to go about winning this game? Well, remember in the last video we saw that if this pawn gets to the 6th rank, it all comes down to a matter of opposition, right? If black is able to gain the opposition, then he will hold a draw, or if white can take the opposition, she can push through and claim victory. So what are the options here with the white pieces? Well, the first option, the first try would be to push our pawn, and this is what a lot of beginners do. They know this pawn needs to get to the other side, so they push it before doing anything else. This is actually a big mistake. I'm going to start by showing why this is a mistake, then we'll go into the winning technique. Well, let's say we push this pawn up, black's going to come forward. Of course, we need to make sure that we can defend it, and suddenly we'll notice that black is the one achieving the opposition here. Now, it's true that we can still drive black back through a series of moves and checks, but eventually we're going to reach that position which we saw in the previous video. So now black steps back to e8, and look, our pawn is on the 6th, and what's going to happen? Well, white can bring the king either to f6 or d6, but either way, black will take that opposition. Black gets the opposition and achieves the draw. This is exactly what we looked at in the previous video. So it is not correct for white to push this pawn right away. White needs to activate the king and use that active king to ensure that you can gain the opposition and win the game. So how do we know where that king needs to go? Well, the big key here has to do with looking at the location of the pawn. If your pawn has yet to cross the halfway point, so if your pawn is anywhere on your half of the board, those first 4 ranks, then the king is going to go to what we call the T of the pawn. So we're going to draw what looks like a little T. We're going to go up 2 squares in front of the pawn, and we're going to highlight these 3 here. You'll notice how this draws out a little T from my pawn, right? If the king can manage to get to any one of these 3 squares, then white is going to be able to win the game. Let's go ahead and show you just why that is the case. So we've drawn out our T. These are our 3 squares. Let's see if we can make it happen. White plays to d2. The king comes up. Let's say we come on up, and look, now we have the opposition. We're covering these squares in front, and black is going to have to give us space. And black moves to the side. Now we're going to bring our king forward. Always take as much space toward the other side of the board as we can with our king, and then push the pawn. We want our king to be as far up as possible, as long as we don't let black's king sneak in and take our own pawn. If black plays to d5, then we can push our pawn. And if the king comes up, we're going to keep that opposition. And you'll notice how white's king is making a road, covering all of these squares so that the white pawn can push all the way on up the board. This is going to be very good. So black has to come back. We keep being able to pave our road. Whoops. In this case, we would push our pawn first. Black comes back, and now, should we push the pawn? No, that would lead to that pawn on the 6th opposition. King to e6 is the critical move here. White gains the opposition, and black must give way. Once black moves, white paves the way for the queen, and we will happily march on up the board. So let's take a look back at that one more time. We've got our pawn here. We want to get to the T in front of the pawn. Let's say our king comes up. And again, we can go to any one of these 3 squares, so even if we don't take the opposition right away, king f4 here is still good. Well, you might say, why is that? Black could play king to f6 and get the opposition. Well, the point is that we can always lose a move to gain the opposition because we're 2 squares in front of our pawn. So our pawn can always move up 1 square and suddenly we'll be the ones with the opposition. So for example, king e4, king e6, and now e3, and black has to give way. King goes to the side, we come back, and again we see that we're able to drive the black king backward and achieve the result that we want. Back to that position with the opposition, forcing the king away. Alrighty, so you might ask yourself, well, what if that pawn is beyond the 4th rank? We just said we have the T of the pawn in the situation where our pawn is not past the 4th rank, but what if our pawn is past the 4th rank? If it's on the opponent's half of the board, then where does our king need to be in order to win? And what we're going to see is that if our king is on the other if the pawn is on the other side of the board, it can actually be even easier sometimes to achieve the position we want. If our pawn is past the halfway point of the board, now it's no longer about the T of the pawn, but any 6 squares in front of the pawn. If we can get our king to any one of these 6 squares, we're going to be able to achieve a draw. So let's imagine that we have a position like this. The king is over here, our king is over here. What should we play with white? Well, we want to get to any one of these 6 squares without black letting us in. So the best move is going to be king to f5. If we had played the move king to d5, then black could play king to d7, and now he's stopping our king from being able to get to any one of those squares. So instead, we're going to run the other way and come to the furthest away square from black. So king to f5, king comes up, and now king to f6. Once our king is in any one of these 6 squares, we're going to be able to pave the way. You'll notice that black is going to have to retreat here. He could try to play a move like king to d8 to try to keep the diagonal opposition, but now just king f7, and look, we control all 3 squares for our pawn, so that's not going to work for black. So if black plays king e8 instead, king to e6 takes the opposition in front, black has to move, and once again, our pawn will run home to freedom. So if the pawn is past the halfway point, then it's no longer a T. You have a whole field in front of your pawn there, all 6 of these squares. If you can get your king to any one of them, then you will achieve the victory. If the pawn is not yet past the halfway point, then you need to be 2 squares in front. You're going to need to be in the T of the pawn in that case. These are the big things you want to be looking for when you're trying to promote your pawn, and if you're on the defending side, you want to see that opponent push that pawn too far, then gain that opposition and try to keep the king at bay. Hopefully this helps to clarify things for you. Always looking for ways to get your kings to those proper squares, paving the path for your pawn. That way you can run on ahead to victory. Can't wait to see you guys put this into practice and see everything that you do in your games to come. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, post any comments, and share via the buttons below. Check out our website at chesswithnick.com for further video, more content, and any postings on lessons, further video analysis, or written analysis that you may be interested in. And be sure to check out our YouTube channel, Chess with Nick, on youtube.com. Have a great day, and wishing you best of luck.